This lecture continues our coverage on open economy macroeconomics by developing the ISLM FX model of output determination in the short run. Our last lecture on the income expenditure model demonstrated that the output market is in equilibrium when output is equal to planned spending expenditures or aggregate demand. That changes in the determinants of spending other than the incomes at home lead to a shift in aggregate demand, and this results in output adjusting to return the market back to equilibrium. We now incorporate this model with the foreign exchange and money markets to provide a general equilibrium model of output determination in an open economy. We do this through a number of steps. First, we develop the investment saving or IS function. The IS curve shows combinations of output and interest rates for which the goods and foreign exchange markets are in equilibrium. The IS curve shows that there is an inverse relationship between interest rates and output through the transmission mechanisms that happen within these two markets. We can show how the IS curve is generated as follows. Let us suppose UIP holds in a foreign exchange market, and the dollar-pound exchange rate, for instance, is in equilibrium. Now, suppose the US interest rate falls. Then, as explained previously, the dollar rate of return on pound deposits are now more attractive than dollar deposits, so that dollar holders will seek to purchase pounds in order to invest in the UK. The dollar will therefore depreciate, causing the dollar-pound rate to rise. A nominal depreciation in turn leads to a real depreciation, as the UK basket of goods is now more expensive than the US basket of goods. The trade balance therefore increases as more US goods are exported to the United Kingdom and less United Kingdom goods imported into the US. The increase in the trade balance increases aggregate demand. But however, that's not all that happens. Along with changes in the foreign exchange market that are finding their way indirectly to the output market, the fall in interest rates also affects the output market directly through an increase in investment spending. Recall that investment spending is also influenced directly by interest rates. Higher rates discourage taking out loans for investment purposes, but lower rates encourage investment spending. So with the fall in US interest rates, investment spending in the United States increases, and this also increases aggregate demand. As planned spending now exceeds output, businesses ramp up production and output increases to restore equilibrium in the output market. We thus have that when US interest rates fall, US output increases via the foreign exchange and output market adjustments, and thus we have the IS function depicting an inverse relationship between interest rates and output. The IS curve is depicted here. As shown, with interest rates on the vertical axis and output on the horizontal axis, if interest rates fall from I prime to I double prime, output rises from Y prime to Y double prime. Again, we see an inverse relationship here depicted. The IS curve will shift to the right when any of the demand factors other than the home interest rate and output change. Listed here are those specific changes that will cause the IS curve to shift up and out to the right. The result is that output increases at the same level of the interest rate. We depict this here. If, for example, the level of government spending is increased, then the IS curve shifts out from IS to IS prime. The result is that at the same interest rate, output in the economy is now higher at Y double prime instead of Y prime. Similarly, a left shift of the IS curve will be brought about by any of the demand factors other than the interest rate or output changing. The specific directions for the respective variables are again listed here. If any of these changes takes place, the IS curve shifts down and to the left. This is again depicted here. If, for example, taxes are increased in this economy, then the IS curve will shift down from IS to IS prime, and this will result in output falling from Y prime to Y double prime at the same interest rate level. Our next task is to develop the liquidity preference money supply or LM function. The LM curve shows the combinations of interest rate and output that ensures that the money market is in equilibrium. The LM curve shows a positive relationship between the interest rates and output due to the interactions that occur within this market. Deriving the LM curve is straightforward. Consider the money market is in equilibrium and we increase the level of output. The real money demand shifts out and exceeds the real money supply at the existing interest rate. The interest rate therefore increases to reduce real money demand back to its initial level to restore equilibrium in the money market. An analogous relationship holds for a decrease in output, which results in a decrease in the interest rate. Thus, we have that output and interest rates are positively related in the money market as captured by the LM function. This is depicted on this slide. With interest rates on the vertical axis and output on the horizontal axis, an increase in US output from Y prime to Y double prime causes the US nominal interest rate to increase from I prime to I double prime. This shows a positive relationship between the two variables. The LM curve will shift to the right if the level of money supply is increased or if there is a decrease in the liquidity preference for real money demand. As depicted here, the LM shifts to the right to LM prime, showing that at the same output level, interest rates fall from I prime to I double prime. Similarly, the LM curve will shift to the left if the level of money supply is reduced or there is an increase in the liquidity preference for real money demand. As depicted here, the LM shifts to the left to LM prime, resulting in an increase in the interest rate from I prime to I double prime. We are now ready to provide the full model of output determination that links the output or goods market to the money and foreign exchange markets. This is the IS-LM model, but we will still affix the foreign exchange market to this setup so that we can more readily see exchange rate adjustments consistent with the IS-LM equilibrium, so that we will refer to this model as the IS-LM FX model. The depiction of this model is seen here for the United States. On the left panel we have the IS and LM functions drawn together in the same interest rate output plane. On the right panel we have the foreign exchange market with the equilibrium nominal exchange rate given by the UIP condition. The US rate of return on dollar assets in the foreign exchange market is the interest rate that's generated from equilibrium in the IS-LM model. It is found at the point of intersection between the IS and LM functions. That intersection also determines the equilibrium level of output in the economy. Given this general equilibrium framework, our concern is how macroeconomic policies affect output, exchange rates, and the trade balance. We shall investigate the impact of temporary monetary and fiscal policies on these variables, both under floating and fixed exchange rate regimes. First, let's consider monetary policy under a floating regime. We suppose that there is a temporary expansion in the US money supply. Say the Fed decides temporarily to increase money supply. Assuming there are no shocks or changes to relevant variables in the economies of the US trade partners, we will expect the following to happen. The increase in money supply will cause the LM curve to shift out to the right. As a result, the interest rate falls to try to restore equilibrium in all markets. The fall in interest rates causes investment spending to increase in the goods market, while at the same time the resulting lower rate of return on dollar deposits causes a nominal depreciation of the exchange rate. This results in a real depreciation and an increase in the trade balance in the goods market. Both effects cause aggregate demand to increase significantly. As a result of this, output increases in the goods market. Higher output, however, causes an increase in interest rates, which results in lower investment spending and a lower trade balance. But also, the trade balance falls from increased imports due to expenditure switching. Aggregate demand therefore falls, but not by much since output has been increasing all this while from the initial fall in interest rates. Equilibrium is therefore reached in the ISLM model and output is above its pre-policy level. The exchange rate has depreciated and the trade balance is higher than before. We show this in graph form next. Note the arrows as they convey much information in terms of understanding the sequence of events. As money supply is increased, LM shifts from LM1 to LM2. This causes interest rates to fall from I1 at the initial output level of Y1. Thus, there is movement along the IS curve as aggregate demand increases. Output now starts to increase, but this causes interest rates to rise again and aggregate demand to fall. The economy therefore arrives at the equilibrium level of output at Y2, interest rates are at I2, and the nominal exchange rate is at E2. The policy thus has the effect of successfully stimulating the economy by increasing output in the short run. Let us now consider monetary policy within a fixed exchange rate regime. We suppose for the sake of demonstration that the United States operates under a fixed regime, pegging its currency, say, to the British pound. If the Fed then decides to expand money supply temporarily, what happens? Well, the LM curve shifts to the right. However, the Fed cannot allow the interest rates to fall, since by operating under a peg its interest rate cannot be changed unilaterally without breaking the peg. The Fed therefore has to simultaneously reduce money supply in order to defend the peg. Monetary policy is therefore not possible under a fixed exchange rate regime. This is depicted here in graph form. An attempt made to expand money supply would shift LM out to the dotted line. This would result in interest rate falling to the blue horizontal dotted line in equilibrium. That, however, would mean that the US rate of return in the foreign exchange market would be lower than that set by the peg, which would in effect break the peg. So by defending the peg, that is reducing money supply back to its original level so that interest rates are not changed, the Fed demonstrates that it cannot alter the level of money supply under a peg or fixed exchange rate regime. Now let us consider fiscal policy, but back to the floating exchange rate regime scenario. Recall that fiscal policy is the use of government spending or tax policy to try to stabilize the economy. So suppose here that the US government decides to temporarily increase its level of spending. Again, we continue to assume that no other changes take place in the United States or abroad in terms of the key variables. What now happens? The increase in government spending will shift the IS curve out to the right as aggregate demand increases. In the goods market, output starts to rise as a result, but the higher output causes interest rates to increase in the money market and the trade balance to fall due to increased imports. Further, the higher interest rate now causes a further reduction in the trade balance via nominal and real appreciation that results, as well as a decrease in investment spending. The result is that aggregate spending now starts to fall, but not by as much due to the fact that output was already increasing, so that a new equilibrium level is arrived at, where the output is above its pre-policy level. This is depicted on this slide. Again, pay close attention to the arrows. The increase in government spending shifts the IS curve out from IS1 to IS2. As you can see, at the initial interest rate I1, output expands considerably. However, the increase in output puts upward pressure on the interest rates to rise above I1, as shown by movement along the LM curve, and in movement along the IS curve as aggregate demand falls as well. The economy ends up in equilibrium at Y2, at the higher interest rate of I2. In the foreign exchange market, the higher interest rate has caused the dollar assets to be more attractive and resulted in an appreciation of the exchange rate, which now falls from E1 to E2. The trade balance is lower though, from both the increased imports resulting from higher incomes and from the real appreciation. The fiscal policy is however effective in raising output from Y1 to Y2, though we observe the crowding out phenomenon as the resulting higher interest rate crowds out both investment spending and net exports. Now, what happens if we implemented fiscal policy under a fixed exchange rate regime? Again, we assume for the sake of demonstration that the US is operating under a fixed exchange rate regime. If the US government therefore decides to temporarily increase its level of spending, what is expected to happen? Well, the IS curve shifts out to the right, and this causes aggregate demand to increase. Output starts to rise in order to restore equilibrium in the goods market. However, the higher output starts to put an upward pressure on interest rates to rise in the money market. Under a peg, interest rates cannot be allowed to rise, so the Fed steps in to maintain the peg by increasing money supply. This has the offsetting effect to the increase in the interest rates, as an increase in money supply shifts the LM function out to the right and puts a downward pressure on interest rates. This causes output to increase considerably without any crowding out effect, as interest rates remain at their initial levels as the peg is defended. The end result is that the exchange rate remains at its initial level while output has increased. We depict this in graph form next. Again, pay close attention to the arrows. As government spending is increased, the IS curve shifts out to the right from IS1 to IS2. Aggregate demand has increased and is causing output to increase from Y1. This causes interest rates to rise from I1 as we move along the LM1 curve. However, the Fed takes action to keep the interest rate from rising by increasing money supply. This shifts the LM1 curve out to LM2, so that the interest rate remains at I1, pegged to the UK interest rate. Output therefore increases to Y2. US interest rates and the exchange rates remain or return immediately to their initial levels, and output is much higher than before the policy. Fiscal policy results in a super effective stimulation of the economy by increasing output significantly. We have seen how the ISLM FX model can be used to understand how monetary and fiscal policies might be used to stimulate the economy under both floating and fixed exchange rate regimes. More generally, these policies can be studied in the context of any stabilization policies that economies might wish to pursue in the short run. Such stabilization policies are often seen as intended to meet short-run objectives of full employment or price stability or both. It is instructive to note that even within a floating regime, the combination of fiscal and monetary policies might achieve the super-effective stimulation that was observed of fiscal policy under a peg, since both policies, if expansionary, might act to keep the interest rate in check and so prevent crowding out while stimulating output. The practice of using these tools is standard across countries, which is why monetary policy autonomy is something that countries wish to retain while operating as open economies. A case study is provided in the text relating to the 1997 Asian crisis, where the effective use of monetary policy in Australia and New Zealand allowed them to combat economic decline effectively. It should, however, be noted that the model, though powerful, in practice does have limitations. They include the fact that often there may be policy constraints. If interest rates, for instance, are already at zero, then even though a country may have monetary policy autonomy, there appears to be little to no scope for using monetary policy to stimulate the economy. A government that operates under a balanced budget may not have room to increase spending. Such similar constraints may exist even when no balanced budget constraint or requirement exists, as when a country is considered a high risk for defaulting. It may not be able to borrow the funds it needs to increase its level of spending. There is also the problem of incomplete information and inside lags, which reflect the real world in which policymakers may not have full information about the economy and necessary macro variables in order to design policy reactions that are optimal. There are also outside lag problems that reflect the added time it takes to get some policy prescription through the political process, as the case is with fiscal policy, as well as the time it takes to see the impact of such policies on the economy. There are also concerns that the effects of these policies are easily predictable and expectations formed which are incorporated into actions taken by people today, so that the policy is effectively neutralized and has no stabilization effect. An example would be where an increase in money supply is met by people who expect to see inflation in the future and as a result increase their demand for money balances today. The result is that the LM curve returns to its original position and the policy of increasing money supply has no impact on the real economy except to generate inflation in the long run. There is also concern that in practice, the linkages between some of these variables may not be as strong as the model suggests. And finally, when there are pegged currency blocks, as when there are several countries with currencies roughly pegged to some particular country's currency, then that country has limited ability to influence its output through policies designed to change the real exchange rate and affect the trade balance. We are now done with this chapter. Take the quiz associated with this lecture and get ready for the final lecture that takes us into a case study on the extreme form of a fixed exchange rate regime, which is a currency union. Here we study the euro.